Thank you for the kind welcome. It is a privilege once again to be here with you at this conference. And I invite you to take your Bibles, if you would, and turn with me to Genesis and to the 37th chapter. Genesis chapter 37. I just want to read the opening 2 verses. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. When it comes to stories, this one is a classic. It's an epic. It's probably one of the finest stories in the whole of the Old Testament. And it is a story that is at least in part known by just about everyone. As people know the name of Noah because of the events relating to the ark, and as they know of Jonah on account of the whale, so people even with a scanty knowledge of the Old Testament will have heard of Joseph on account of his multicolored coat. If they'd never heard of him because they had learned of him in Sunday school and read their Bibles, they perhaps in the last 20 years have heard of him because of the work of Rice and Weber in Joseph and his amazing technicolored dream coat. And here in chapter 37 and in verse 2, we're introduced to Joseph as a young man of 17. Now between that point and a period of time 93 years later, when at the age of 110 he finally dies, we are provided with biographical details which are startling and profoundly important. The story of Joseph is perhaps the classic Old Testament illustration of the truth of Romans 8 and verse 28. One of the best known verses in the New Testament, and I would suggest humbly one of the most abused verses in the New Testament. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. What does that mean? Is it simply just a little cliche that is to be above our kitchen sink, a little mantra that we quote in the car when the traffic is a little heavier than usual on the way home? Is it something that we may deal with in the superficial kind of way that suggests that somehow or another it'll all work out in the end? The sort of Christian version of the Muslims, que sera, sera, whatever will be, will be. Well, certainly no. It is a wonderful expression of God's providence and of His sovereignty, and the fact that He is determined that He will work all things out according to the purpose of His will, and that the good towards which He always conforms everything and works the events of our lives towards is, of course, the conforming of us to the image of His Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. And that's why so many of the things that work together for good are not on the surface in themselves particularly good. They are illness and disappointment and pain and failure and discouragement and tears. And yet in the midst of all of that, we are able to say, as Cowper said, God moves in a mysterious way His wonders to perform. He plants His footsteps in the sea and He rides upon the storm. The story of Joseph is a story of bitter jealousy, of deceit, slavery, misrepresentation, injustice, lust, forgiveness, sibling rivalry, imprisonment, deep trials that are minus self-pity, great prosperity that comes without pride. And in it all, there is, as I say to you, the overarching theme of God's sovereignty over the affairs of time and of His providential watch care over those who are His own. And essentially what I'd like to do on the 3 occasions that I have the privilege of opening the Scriptures is speak to you on the theme of the sovereignty of God, and particularly from the life of Joseph, at least dipping into it a little. It is important for us in these days of great confusion and of political chaos to remind ourselves that while men and women who remain without hope and without God in the world continue to imagine that if ever there was a creator, and they are questioning that, of course, if ever there was a creator, having created, we have now been left to our own devices. And so we are somehow spinning hopelessly and helplessly. And therefore, anything that anyone can do, or anything that we may frantically engage in order to prevent the drift and the flotsam and jetsam of life catching us up and overwhelming us, is something that we need to lay hold on. But the Christian who understands their Bible, who has come to a knowledge of God in all of His fullness, recognizes that in direct contrast to that, we are not trapped in the grip of blind forces. We are not left to fate or to fortune or to chance or to luck, but rather we are left to the conclusion that all that happens to us is divinely planned, and that each event of life as it unfolds for us is rich with opportunities to fashion in us trust and obedience and joy and gratitude. And therefore, if nothing else were to happen out of these events, I hope that in measure I would be able to eradicate one of the sad and sorry continual statements made to me by believers who ought to know far better, and that is the dreadful use of the phrase, "I wish you good luck." It is incredible to me how many people tell me, "Good luck with the service, good luck with the trip, good luck with the next thing." I know, of course, that they don't believe in luck or in chance. At least I want passionately to believe that they don't. But the more and more they say it, the more I'm led to wonder, and the more I'm forced to consider again this great and thorough biblical teaching on the sovereignty of God. Now, what I'd like to do this evening is something that a wise man would not do, and that is to consider the incidents in and the influences on the life of Joseph prior to our discovery of him here at the age of 17. Now, there is no question that Joseph's family ties were quite spectacular. Abraham was his great-grandfather. Isaac was his grandfather. Jacob was his dad. And Rachel was his mom. And I could encourage you by means of homework just to dip into these chapters of Genesis, which give to us some of this background information. Jacob, his father, was known as the deceiver or the chiseler. His name quite literally meant that. He was masterful at scheming and dreaming and conniving and manipulating. And when we read the events, we discover that he manipulated his brother out of his birthright in Genesis 25, and that he manipulated the blessing which ought to have fallen to his brother to himself by means of a very manipulative procedure involving his mother. He was a deceiver, but he was also an achiever. When he set his mind to something, he was able to pull it off. Nowhere is this more clear than in Genesis 29, when he sets his sights on a cute girl by the name of Rachel. By this time, he's in the context of his uncle's domain, and having stayed with him a whole month or two, he had begun to spy out the lie of the land, as any young man might. And in Genesis 29:16, we're told Laban had two daughters, and the name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah had weak eyes, but Rachel was lovely in form and beautiful, and Jacob was in love with Rachel. And he said, "I'll work for you for 7 years if I can marry her." That's commitment. That's commitment. Certainly vast in contrast from the young man who wrote to his girlfriend, "I would climb the highest mountain for you, swim the widest ocean, walk across the burning desert in my bare feet, and all for your love and your affection. And I will see you on Saturday evening at 6, provided it's not raining." Now, Jacob was far removed from that. And if you turn your gaze upon the story, you discover that he is focused in getting what he wants. Ironically, his uncle deceives him by giving him Leah, the older daughter. And you can read this amazing story in Genesis 29. You have to understand it in the Eastern context. The wearing of veils, the great propriety that marked out any kind of courtship procedure. And so it was that it was only in the final acts of physical expressions of love that he discovers, goodness gracious, I'm here with a wrong girl. And in the morning he comes out and he says to his father-in-law, "Nice one, Laban." You gave me the wrong girl. Laban says, hey, that's the way it goes. I can't marry off the younger until I've married off the older. You got the older, relax. No, he said, I want the younger. He said, fine, stick with her for a week in terms of fulfilling, the post-marital obligations, and then I'll give you Rachel if you work for me for another 7 years. So he says, fine. And so for 14 years, he works because of his focus and his desire. Now, when you follow the story through from here, the family picture album was already very full by the time that Joseph made his appearance. Leah gives birth to 4 children in a row. You can read this in Genesis 29 and 32 and following, and it's really quite wonderful. She gave birth to a son. She named him Reuben, and then she had another one, and she called him Simeon, and then she had another Levi and another Judah. Now, unfortunately, Rachel didn't get off to such a flying start. Indeed, she got off to no start at all when it came to childbearing. And so in verse 1 of chapter 30, we discover that Rachel, when she saw she wasn't bearing Jacob children, became jealous of her sister. And so she creates the context, which was normal in the time, for her maidservant to go in and to be as Jacob's wife. And so she in turn produces for Jacob and for Rachel Dan and Naphtali. And then Leah, whose productivity had kind of slowed down, decides two can play that game. And so she gives her maidservant to her husband Jacob as well. And between the two of them, they give birth to Gad and to Asher. And so it goes on. I mean, it's a quite incredible chapter all the way through 30. These babies are popping out all over the place. 19, Leah conceived again, and she bore Jacob a 6th son. And Leah said, God has presented me with a precious gift. This time my husband will treat me with honor because I have borne him 6 sons. So she named him Zebulun. And then she gave birth to a daughter and named her Dinah. And then God remembered Rachel. He listened to her and opened her womb. And she became pregnant and gave birth to a son and said, God has taken away my disgrace. And she named him Joseph and said, may the Lord add to me another son. So it takes all of this stuff before Joseph finally walks onto the stage of human history. And in all of this, God was working things together for good. Now, it's soon after Joseph's arrival that Jacob tells his uncle that it is time for them to relocate. Verse 25 of chapter 30, around there you'll find it. He determines it's good for them now to go back to Canaan. It doesn't happen straight away. It may have been, actually, that the period of time that elapsed allowed Joseph to at least get beyond the toddler stage and to become a little boy. Commentators estimate that the events that we're now about to consider took place when he was around the age of 6 or 7. You can imagine him to be an inquisitive little fellow, interested in everything that's going on, aware of far more than he probably should be, and into this, that, and the next thing. And I want you to understand the humanity of this story. One of the dangers with familiarity is that we just say, oh yes, the story of Joseph, know about that, in the pit, out the pit, coat, no coat, done, been there, got the t-shirt, fine, thank you, now let's move to the book of Leviticus. Hold your horses for a moment. I'm asking you to think. Maybe unsettling for some, but try it, all right? Imagine now that he is around the age of 6 or 7. If that were the case, and there is no reason to believe that it wouldn't have been, it is distinctly possible that many of the things that his mom and dad were doing would have been immediately accessible to him. For example, Genesis chapter 31 and verse 19. Look at it. They're now planning their departure. Jacob, verse 17, put his children and his wives on camels, and he drove all his livestock ahead of him, along with him all the goods he had accumulated in Padan Aram, to go to his father Isaac in the land of Canaan. And when Laban had gone to shear his sheep, Rachel stole her father's household gods. Now, Joseph, like any normal wee boy, would have asked, hey, Mom, why are we taking Grandpa's stuff? Why are we taking Grandpa's stuff when Grandpa's not here? And it would have registered in his young mind and contributed to the sense of unsettlement that also attached to the fact that they were on the move and there seemed to be something deceptive and hurried about it all. He seemed to be caught up in something that was larger than himself. Do you think Joseph was in the circle when the events of 26 and following took place? When Laban, discovering that his son-in-law and his daughters had gone, when he sent off with his folks and gradually caught up on Jacob, and discovered that Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country of Gilead, and overtook him, and camped there. And then verse 26, Laban said to Jacob, "What have you done? You've deceived me, and you've carried off my daughters like captives in war. Why did you run off secretly and deceive me?" Now you can imagine Joseph standing on the circle of this thing and saying to himself in his young mind, "That's exactly what I was thinking. I can't wait to hear what he says to this. I wonder why my dad did this. I wonder why we have run off in this way." And he would have understood, as his grandpa says in verse 27, "Why didn't you tell me, so that I could send you away with joy and singing, to the music of tambourines and harps? You didn't even let me kiss my grandchildren and my daughters goodbye." Now, there isn't a grandpa in this room right now that doesn't register with that. And Joseph, reared in this environment, was reared at the apron strings of a deceitful mom and dad. "Why did you not let me even say goodbye to my grandchildren?" he said. Do you think that Joseph's eyes did anything other than narrow when he heard the question coming out of his grandpa's lips in verse 30? "Now you have gone off because you long to return to your father's house." I understand that, he said. "But why did you steal my gods?" Oh, now he's standing to attention. The first question was a tough one. Why didn't I get to kiss the kids goodbye? But it was nowhere as tough as this one. Why did you steal my gods? Jacob said, "Listen, I was afraid because I thought you'd take your daughters away from me by force. True or not true, we don't know. But if you find anyone who has your gods, he shall not live." Now you can imagine Joseph going, "Goodness gracious me! My mom took the stuff. My dad doesn't know. My grandpa's ticked. And now my dad says, if you find it on anyone, they'll die." And Joseph's saying, "I wonder what's going to happen now." And so are you if you don't remember the story. And so Laban starts going through the tents. And he's going here and there looking for the stuff. Verse 34, "Now Rachel had taken the household gods and put them inside her camel's saddle and was sitting on them. Laban searched through everything in the tent but found nothing." Now, Rachel could have let it go. It's highly unlikely that her father would have doubted her or would ever have conceived that she was sitting on the things. But when you become deceitful and when your conscience begins to work in you, you tend to start answering questions that you weren't even asked. And that's what happens when kids come home, when they stayed out half an hour later than they should. They start volunteering information, and their parents are going, "I wonder why they're volunteering the information." And then, of course, you only need to be a parent for a little while, and you understand that they try and volunteer certain information that is absolutely bogus in the hope that you won't inquire about information that is absolutely necessary. And that's exactly what she does. "Oh, don't be angry, my lord. She said that I cannot stand up in your presence." Her father said, "I never expected you to stand up in my presence." Then she says, "It's the time of month, and I'm not able to take care of things." And so he searched, but he could not find the household gods. Track the chapter through, and you come to the final verse. And what a wealth of emotional baggage is contained in the concluding verses there of Genesis 31. Look at the scene in verse 55. Early the next morning, Laban kissed his grandchildren and his daughters, and he blessed them. And then he left and returned home. And through it all, God was working all things together for good for his servants. Some of you have been there. You've lived 55. You've lived verse 55 many times with your children. You know what that's like. I've done it in reverse. Watching as the stature of my father, which isn't big to begin with, became increasingly diminished as the 747 crawled itself into the morning Scottish sky. And knowing that if I could see right down into the immediacy of the thing, I'd only see his shoulders shake, and I'd only hear his heart break. See, the Bible is a very human book. And the stories of God's servants are historical stories. And the events of Joseph's experience here, as they begin to unfold, are woven with dark threads and mysterious things and elements of life that he could never fully understand or grasp as he was going through. And loved ones, is that not true of us? If we track back through the days of our lives, irrespective of how young or old we might be, we recognize that somehow or another God has been fashioning with the threads of our humanity things that we would never have asked for, events that we would never have prescribed. And yet through it all, in mountains and in valleys and in the experiences of deep disappointment, conforming everything to the purpose of his will. I speak into the life of somebody tonight who has come out of an experience of deep sadness or fearfulness. You have come and the circumstances around you are buffeted by factors over which you have no control. You feel yourself, as it were, to be on a camel's back in a journey into oblivion. And you wonder, what in the world do I have to hold on to? And where may I find stability in all of this? In the God of Abraham and of Isaac and of Jacob, who fashioned you in your mother's womb, who intricately wrought you, who created your DNA exactly as he planned, who ordered the very moment of your birth and fashioned the nails on your fingers, and who has guarded you and kept you and knows you as the very apple of his eye, and the very hairs of your head are numbered, and your name is graven on the palms of his hands. Don't look away to Peking and Washington and London as if somehow or another these poor souls held our future in their grasp. Let the fearful look down. Let the pessimist look around. But let the Christian lift his eyes and look up and into the face of Almighty God, who was ordering the steps of his servant Joseph. Now, as you continue in the story, you discover that Jacob, when he realizes that he's going to meet Esau in 32, recognizes that this is not exactly something that he was particularly looking forward to. And he sets it up in a certain way that hopefully he'll be able to win his brother over. And he receives word in verse 6. We went to your brother Esau, this is 32:6, and now he is coming to meet you. That's the good news. And 400 men are with him. That's the bad news. And verse 7, in great fear and distress, Jacob divided the people who were with him into two groups. Now he's really freaked out, but he is smart. Boy, is this guy smart. And he divides them, the flocks and the herds and the camels as well, thinking to himself, if Esau comes and attacks one group, I'll still have one group left. This guy is crafty. And then Jacob prays, oh, help! Now try to get under the humanity of the story again. Any kid is going to say to his mother, why is Dad not here? Why did Dad stay over there? Now he wasn't to know, but he was to discover that when his father reappears, his father comes limping. Don't you think he asked his dad, what happened to you over there? Do you think his father answered? I don't know. Did his father use it as an opportunity to explain to him that in the midst of all his deception and deceiving practices and how he hadn't really been as forthright as he should, that God met with him and arrested him in his life? That he broke him? I'm no wrestler. My son can confirm that. But I do know that right around here is pivotal in wrestling. Right around the hips. And if you can immobilize a person around here in these crucial areas, you've done it. And he got immobilized there. God broke him. Tozer said it is questionable whether a man will ever be used greatly by God until he has been hurt deeply. I don't want to start some great controversy, but I want you to know that we sang the song incorrectly, and that is printed in the hymn book incorrectly. The song is penned, read, Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on me. Break me, melt me, mold me, fill me. Oh, you say, who do you think you are coming in here telling us about our songs in our own book? Why don't you go back where some of your songs were from and check on them? Okay, that's fine, I will. But Iverson's son worshipped in our church. And we happened to sing the song correctly. And Iverson said, it is a refreshing treat to have the song sung as my father penned it. Broken before used. And along the journey of his life, Jacob was to be broken again and again, and the opportunity to share that with his son in the way that Abram had shared it with one before him was there. There's no indication whether he did or whether he didn't. By the time you reach chapter 33, by the time they've reached Shechem, certainly he's building an altar. He's focusing his family. He's distinguishing them from the surrounding culture. And after the pitching of the tent and the building of the altar at the end of 33, you then have in 34 the violation of Dinah's purity, the only girl in the house, and she is violated by the activities of an individual. And then in 34, you have this amazing story of the deceitful savagery of the rest of the brothers and how they brutalized the city, plundered the city, mayhem. Was Joseph part of that? Probably not, too young. Maybe. Did he hold the jackets? Did he watch from a distance? Did he sit at home and wait for them to come back with blood all over their hands and say to himself, what kind of family is this to live in? And what about Jacob's reaction? Verse 30, the end of chapter 34, Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, you've brought great trouble on me by making me a stench to the Canaanites and Perizzites. The sons would go, hello? Why didn't you do something about your daughter, Dad? Are you only concerned about yourself? What about our sister? And Joseph listening and thinking and processing and wondering. And through it all, God working things together for good. Chapter 35. Jacob comes back to where he'd been before. He'd been in Bethel before, remember? When he was fleeing from Esau. You can read that in 28. He has the people purify themselves. God makes his presence known. His name is changed. And then as you turn the page, bereavement hits the family. We have the funeral for Deborah. That's his grandmother's nurse. Then in verse 18, we have the tragic loss of his own mother. In giving birth to her son Benjamin, we're told she breathed her last. And Rachel died and was buried. And Joseph was 12 years old. 12 years old. And like any other 12-year-old, trying to put together the pieces in the puzzle of life. trying to understand what was important and what was true and what was real and what was realistic to think about this God of Abraham and of Isaac and this God of his father Jacob. And as he stood as a 12-year-old boy and watched as they mounded up the earth over the hole that had now consumed his mom, and as they put a tombstone there, and as they prayed and departed, God was working all things out, weaving another dark thread into the tapestry of Joseph's life. Chapter 35 ends with the death of his grandfather, another burial service. As he breathes his last and dies and is gathered to his people old and full of years, and his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. And again Joseph standing around, confronted by the frailty of life and the reality of death and the opportunity of faith. Now, loved ones, if this wasn't bad enough to deal with in your family, look at verse 22 of chapter 35. While all of these funerals are going on, while all of this disappointment and heartache is consuming and ripping into the life of this family, while Israel was living in that region, Reuben went in and slept with his father's concubine Bilhah. And Israel heard of it. And you can be sure if Israel, namely Jacob, heard of it, Joseph heard of it too. And Joseph now, as he moves into his teenage years, is forced to try and process this information. His brothers are a bloody mass murdering group. One of them has now taken into his domain essentially his father's wife, and is involved in incestuous relationships. And Joseph, as he would pull the blankets up around him at night, and as he would put his head on his pillow, and as he would have been taught to pray, at least by his grandpa, he must have said, oh God, what is this all about? What will become of us? Oh God of my great-grandpa, and God of my grandfather, and God of my father, what am I to be? What am I to become? And through it all, God is fashioning the events of life. In the rough and tumble of a less than perfect family, God was preparing Joseph for a unique role in his purposes. If ever there was a 17-year-old boy who could argue that the reason he had become such a downright mess, which he didn't, was because of his brothers and because of his mom, and because she told lies, and because his dad was a deceiver, and because he never explained this, and he didn't do that. And Joseph, you would expect him in 20th century terms to have become a hell's angel, doing drugs, a total write-off. And if he had been so, he would have been justified from a human perspective in saying, but you don't understand. You can't blame me. I come from a dysfunctional family, you see. I want to tell you something. You come from a dysfunctional family. And so do I. And so does everyone who comes from a family. Because families are made of sinful people. And even sinful singles don't function the way they're supposed to function. So when you take one sinful single and you introduce her to another sinful single, and then they get it going together, you got chaos on your hands. And then you produce children, and they are born into that chaos. So there is one sense in which we're all in it together, and there is another sense in which let us learn from the life of Joseph that we can't play this trump card. Well, you don't understand. The reason I am the way I am, not with Joseph. Somehow or another, in the midst of all of this, Joseph was to make the amazing discovery that there is more progress made in life through failure and through tears than through success and laughter. And the more we try to get success and get laughter and to shun trials and to enjoy blessings, the more we miss the opportunity for God's provision for us in quite dramatic ways. And that is not to say that we go out and seek it. God's grace, you see, in the events of these family ties was greater than the daunting complexities of Joseph's early life. And the only explanation for Joseph on his 17th birthday, and the only explanation for the part that Joseph was to play and for the honor that God was to confer upon him is explained in terms of God's electing grace. God determined that Joseph was going to be this. And God ordered all of the events of Joseph's life to put him in the exact place with the exact background and the exact dependence so that he might become the very Savior of the brothers, as we'll see tomorrow morning if anyone shows up. The very brothers who maligned him. St. Augustine said that trials come to prove us and to improve us. Again, Cowper says, judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust him for his grace. Behind a frowning providence, he hides a smiling face. And you have to wait, actually, to 45, but we'll never, ever get there. And in 45, we discover the perspective of Joseph through it all, when it all comes out in the wash, as it were. Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. When they'd done so, he said, I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. No wonder there's an exclamation mark at the end of verse 4. Because his brothers never knew until that moment that this fine, strapping Egyptian character, so called and so thought, was none other than their brother. And he says to them, and now do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. And what of Jacob as a dad? There are dads here tonight. What a striking illustration of the impact that we will have upon our children. There's no question that Jacob did not set a particularly good example. He didn't do a very good job when it came to matters of integrity and to the issues of decisiveness and taking action in the right way and in the right time. He tended largely all the way through his life to avoid issues rather than to address them. In fact, he gave Joseph lots of reasons for maligning his dad, blaming his dad, abusing his dad. But if you look at chapter 50 and the account of the death of his dad, Joseph threw himself upon his father and he wept over him and he kissed him. He didn't love his dad because he was a perfect dad. And if you're here as a kid tonight, you're not going to love your dad because he's a perfect dad either, because there aren't any perfect dads. There's only one perfect Father, and he's our Father who art in heaven. But apart from that, there are no perfect dads. So can I just say something to you kids? How about cutting your dads a little bit of slack? And maybe a word to the wives in passing. Some of the men are about dying under the weight of all these directives that are calling them to human perfection. Lighten up a little, would you? It isn't going to happen. They can't be perfect in their job, perfect as a provider, perfect in their marriage, perfect in their fathering, any more than any of the rest of us can. And we love our dads not because they're perfect. And Joseph must have on many occasions looked across at his dad, said, Dad, you're my dad, and I love you, man. And Jacob would have looked back at him and said, "Hey, Joseph, you're my boy, and I love you, son." And in it all and through it all, God was fashioning His purpose. One day our children will stand at the spot in the grass where they have erected our tombstone. One day our children will tell the stories of us when they stand and gaze at the tombstone, and where the wind blows over it, and when its place remembers it no more. What then? Well, there's a fair amount of chaos and rubble in all of our backgrounds. But out of that rubble and out of that chaos, Joseph would have been glad to sing, "You gave me beauty for ashes, and the oil of joy for mourning, and the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness." The hymn writer, in recognizing the way in which God works, and with this I close, writes a wonderful hymn. "My God, I thank Thee, who hast made the earth so bright, so full of splendor and of joy, beauty and light. So many glorious things are here, noble and right." In other words, hey, it's a nice day, the sun's out, and the sky's blue, and I've got a job, and I put my hand in my pocket, and I have gum, and that's good because I wanted gum, and everything's just grooving, you know. But that's only one day. Then he writes in the next verse, "I thank Thee more that all our joy is touched with pain, that shadows fall on brightest hours, and thorns remain, so that earth's bliss may be our guide, and not our chain." Some of us are chained to the good life. And God is choosing to break the chain. And it's painful, but it's purposeful. For as in Joseph's life, all things work together for good for those who love God, who are the called according to His purpose. Let us just take a moment in silent prayer, and then we will be led to